Okay, everyone, good afternoon. Thanks, first of all, for staying with it. It's been a grueling day between all the sessions, all the speakers, and the variable heat from the rooms going from hot to cold to hot again. So thank you very much for that. We've came to the end of the session, and this is the kind of wrap-up session. And we will be finished by 4:30, so that's the first thing to say, so that you know that you will get home at some point today. But there's loads to reflect on today, and probably too much for this session. And even my own personal thing from the very first session and all the material, I'd like to watch that back and look a bit more closely at some of the slides and analysis. But we've kept, along with the reflections, we've kept the best to last. We've got two speakers that you haven't heard yet in the plenary session, and that's really good. And we're going to hear a little bit more from Gerry, and then Anton is going to close the day. So that's the process. So I'm going to introduce our two speakers. We have Alenka Smerkolj. I've been trying to pronounce that all day without much success. Who's the Minister without portfolio responsibility for development, strategic projects and cohesion in the Slovenian government. Sorry about that. That was a tongue twister. And I've had the pleasure of hearing Alenka speak earlier at the business breakfast and also in the workshop. So she's maybe going to give us a flavour of that today in this session. And then I'm really pleased also on my right to have Gemma Corrigan, who's an economist at the World Economic Forum. For those that know the World Economic Forum, they've been an international organisation that have been very involved in inclusive growth as well and bringing forward that agenda. So it's really good to have them on the platform and to hear from Gemma. And obviously we heard Gerry this morning, who came in at the end of the first plenary session and still had something to say after all the other speakers, which was a testament to you, Gerry. So Gerry's going to give us some final thoughts as well. So we won't stand in ceremony, and if we can, we'll invite Alenka to open us up. Thank you.
Thank you, Gerry, for the floor. I think it's very difficult to speak in the last session because everybody's already tired and want to go home. But still, I think that I hope you will not really fall asleep. What I would like to share with you today is a little bit of what we are doing in Slovenia on inclusive growth. So already at the beginning I have to say that as soon as we started to discuss inclusive growth, people said, oh, no, this is not an expression we like, this is a buzzword. Let's talk about something else. But at the end of the day we came to the same thing. We just describe it with different words, but you'll see. It's still the same inclusive growth we need to follow. So what we are currently doing is we are in a stage of finalizing our long-term development agenda. And we are in a process of, last week we had a government session where the government said, well, yes, the document is good enough to go into public consultation. So we now are in the official stage of public consultation, and hopefully the document will be out in December. So the document really builds on a few pillars. One big pillar is the vision of Slovenia, and I will just say a few words a little bit later about it. It builds on the second pillar, which is, of course, the current state of economy, current state of environment, current state of society. And on the other side, of course, we also take into account global challenges. And the whole package, the whole agenda is designed also around the Sustainable Development Goals. We were pretty happy, I think, that basically at the time we started and we embarked on this process, also in the United Nations, the Sustainable Development Goals were adopted. So it was pretty natural for us to try and merge the two processes. So yes, now we have a document which connects both processes, so the long-term national goals and together in the same document, the Sustainable Development Goals. But perhaps before I move on, I would just first like to share a few words about the vision, because it was not a very easy exercise, and it took a lot of time, but I think it's really worthwhile for anybody to go the way we went. So when, Slovenia is a very young country. We are only 25 years old. And when we were a very unified nation when we decided to go away from the former Yugoslavia. And we had a very clear vision. We want to join the European Union, so we did, and join the Eurozone, and we did. And when we came to that and we finalized the step, we were just like, well, what's next? And there was no next. And that's the reason why when we first discussed the idea of the National Development Agenda also with the OECD, it became very, very clear that what the country needs is a vision that can, again, put a sort of a guidance more than anything else for any policy maker, for any strategy, for anybody to focus on for the future. So it has a very long-term mark. It is 2050. So we didn't want to write it ourselves because it wouldn't make sense. So we reached out to people, and it took us a year. It's a very long process when you start engaging with stakeholders, workshops, we went wherever we were invited. And at the end of the day, this February, we came with a document, and the whole document is around 5 pillars. And 3 of them are not really a lot of countries have visions like, we want to have a better quality of life and well-being. That was the biggest part that came out in any conversation that we had. We want to be happy. I'm still being ridiculized, Everybody's making jokes about me when I come with the happiness. But that's what really came out. And, politicians, it's very difficult to understand, but this is what we are here about and for, I guess. But it's not easy even if I speak to the members of the government about it. But fine, I don't mind. I think it's the right way. The second big pillar is that we want to be an innovative society by 2050, that we want to learn, that we want to really go for lifelong learning. And I think this is really the pillars, and you build around everything. What came a little bit with surprise to us, and also not very necessarily would come out everywhere else, is that Slovenians, we want to keep our own identity. It came out very, very, very much. Our language, our culture. And the last one, which hurts a lot, especially the politicians, is that the biggest issue Slovenia has is lack of trust. And it's not just about the lack of trust in institutions, it's about the lack of trust in government, institutions, and also trust among people. So we have something to work on, and that was the base also when we started to develop and design the development strategy. So basically, now I already explained that the second big thing that really was centered and was in the, let's say, in our mind all the time was also the Sustainable Development Goals, which is, of course, which we don't take just as something we need to follow because it's an international commitment, but also because we believe that this agenda can really catalyze the change in the right direction for the whole society, for the whole planet. If I just move to the central goal, this is somehow how we more or less describe what we want to achieve by 2030. So we have the same time frame as the development agenda. And it doesn't really, it's not that important, but the most, what we want to somehow achieve is 5 pillars that are completely interconnected, and there is none of the pillars is much more important than the others. And one builds around society, one builds around environment, one builds around economy that produces, which is an inclusive one, productive, but that has benefits for all. And then the last two are that we want to really build and invest in learning for and through life, so throughout our entire life. And that's what we need to achieve that, and it's the same. It's crucial as well. So we put it at the same, let's say, level as also that we need to have an inclusive and efficient governance, because this is also something that is not really an optimal thing in Slovenia yet. So that's and of course the main goal. What we did want to have is that the whole strategy and these most important strategic orientations are people-centered. So it's about us. It's about the inhabitants of the Republic of Slovenia. It's not about anybody else. So we are somehow in the center. So that's the general idea. The rest is more. It's just like, it is the last slide. I will not bother you with slides, but this is how the whole, this is the big picture. So you just have the quality of our life for all, yes, well-being for all, the 5 strategic orientations, which are going to be pursued via 12 concrete goals. The goals in the strategy are then described, and they have already, let's say, some pathways and actions to be taken. And what is also important is that each of the 12 goals has also its performance indicators, 2 to 3. But still, so altogether there are 29 indicators in this performance framework, but there are 6 that are somehow, that we call them key indicators. And they go and somehow make the whole umbrella plan an inclusive growth agenda. What you have also at the end is especially how each goal is interconnected and dependent on others. I think it's extremely important to really show it, because when you design it and the different ministries are around the table, you know, these are silos. And by doing this, at least you start forcing them to start discussing, because it's really 2, 3, sometimes even more, 4, 5 ministries that need to take a decision to move in the right direction and not move like this. And then the last part is just the connection of each our goal with the Sustainable Development Agenda. So that's more or less, in a few words, what the whole strategy is all about. I hope it's going to be now. Really, it's still discussed. It has been discussed heavily already. It's discussed with all the parties, also with the opposition parties. And I hope that we somehow will be able to conclude it in December this year. And then the first 6 months of next year, it's going to be the part where the action plan and concrete actions, we already have the idea of how to build around that. That's the third big phase will somehow conclude everything. So the most important part, and I think that the toughest thing that we somehow encountered along the road was how to break the silos mentality. That's, everything else is easy. And when we started, and we had, especially with the design ideas that came from different stakeholders, forcing ministries to start discussing and even talking to each other, that was the hardest not to break. We are not there yet, but in some of the goals, we already see that even voluntarily, people now started to discuss. It's a big achievement, even though it doesn't look like. So I think in any strategy, everywhere around the world, this is at least in Slovenia, that's the toughest thing. And you find out that it's so easy to speak, like here today, when you're in a room with like-minded people and everybody understands. This is not the case when you are in a government session or somewhere else, because interests go different ways, and these are the most important things, but we need to push it, because otherwise you don't make a change, and that's the most problematic thing. So you have to be stubborn enough to push and push and push, and even if people are making jokes of you, you have to still push. So I don't care much to... I'm beginning to feel like an elephant already. My skin is growing. But I still believe, I really believe in the project, and now we have something to show, and it's being discussed, and the business is saying, wow, but that's interesting, and when the opposition party says, well, but this can be our program, wow, you feel, oh, okay, I did something good. Not myself, everybody, because this is not a document that was written by politicians. It's, I cannot even say, and it's very difficult to comment on it. Very difficult. It has its basis, it has its analytics, it has everything you need, but it's been somehow written by, the content came from everybody. That would conclude what I wanted to say, what I wanted to share, and if somebody would like to learn on that, we are prepared to share this experience, because I think it's the right one to go forward.
Thank you very much. That was really powerful to hear your own journey in terms of this framework. And actually, for the government officials, there'll be a lot of parallels in the room. We feel your, I wouldn't say anxiety, but we feel the kind of tension in how you try and drive frameworks through. But thank you very much for sharing that. We will now proceed to Gemma, who's going to give us a perspective from the World Economic Forum and some reflections on today.
Thank you. Well, first I'd like to thank the organizers for convening us all here today, and thank all of you for your continued commitment to this very important agenda. I think we've come a long way, but we still have quite a ways to go, and I'd just like to briefly recap on some of the takeaways and the recurring themes that we heard today, as well as offer a little insight into how the forum is trying to take and move some of these issues forward. We have several new initiatives underway, which I think hope to answer many of the questions that still remain today, and hopefully will form the basis of many more discussions to come. In terms of some of the key learnings for me was the need for a unified approach. I think inclusive growth needs to be an integrated agenda. It's not an economic or a social issue. The two go hand in hand, and they're inextricably interlinked, and I think those might be words that I'm taking from the IMF. But the OECD, the IMF, the World Economic Forum, and all the other great organizations pushing this agenda, I think, need to continue to stress the holistic approach that's required. I think we need to rewire our economies. There needs to be a new compass, and that starts with better metrics. Moving beyond GDP is a first step, but we need also more granular analysis. We need to look at more of the local level and have more subnational and distributional data, and there's a long way to go there to bring it down to the local level. I think we really have to, actually there was a really nice quote I heard earlier today that we shouldn't pride ourselves or treasure what we measure, but actually measure what we treasure, which really stuck with me. And I hope that we can continue to make progress in that regard. I think the other big takeaway for me is the need to move more from aspiration to action. We at the World Economic Forum launched a new benchmarking report in Davos this year, the Inclusive Growth and Development Index, which aims to benchmark economies on how inclusive their economies are, taking a much more holistic measure and looking not at only living standards, but looking at the distributional aspects of growth, so how inclusive it is, as well as the intergenerational aspects, so how much of this might be at the expense of future generations to come, how much is this coming at the expense of the environment and the fiscal constraints as well for the future. And I think it's really important that we start to walk the talk and now move this into implementation. And what we're hearing from a lot of economies is that, there's a lot of willpower out there, but they don't really have all the answers and they don't really know how to roll this out. I think Scotland's doing a really great job of leading the way, showing what can be done. I think there's very clear priorities and commitments, but still we don't really have all the answers, like I said before. We have some evidence of what works, but we don't really systematically share this with one another. We don't really know very well what doesn't work, and that should be something that's much easier to come across and something that's much easier to compare from one economy to another and from one sector to another. So I think even understanding better what approaches are there out there, how governments are pursuing this, and businesses as well, because they have their role to play as well, and to share this in a more systematic way. And to that end, what we're trying to do, actually, we're building a platform now called Grow Inclusive, which we hope to launch by early to mid next year, which will crowdsource what we find the most innovative, novel, and promising solutions out there, so that there's one place that policymakers, business leaders, and civil society leaders and other stakeholders interested in advancing this agenda can go to not only learn about what works and what doesn't, but also to connect with one another and to make it easier for different stakeholders to collaborate, join forces. And I think our organization really sees the power of partnerships. Some of the best examples that we've gotten to date were ones that really combined governments, NGOs working locally with strong private sector involvement, which really allows some of these things to scale. And I think the issue we have today is scale. And if we look at the challenges that are coming tomorrow, if we're not even prepared for today, how are we going to tackle the fast-paced technological change to come? So I'd really like to leave you all with a sense of urgency, and also to stress that we all need to do this together. We really need a united front, and no one stakeholder can do it alone. And I think if we join forces, and we have quite a coalition of the willing sitting here today, but we much need to broaden this conversation, bring other stakeholders in, and even beyond this room right here, really try to scale and get more actors on board. I think regarding again, going back to the role of business, another piece of work that we have currently underway is coming up with a common framework for the private sector to track and measure their economic, social, and environmental footprint or impact. So we're working with several businesses to harmonize the different metrics and tools that they're currently using, so that citizens and governments can assess, which sectors are making the biggest contribution, and for us to really try to put more pressure on businesses to deliver more. And that's a piece of work that we'll have coming out in the year to come as well. So if anyone's interested in that piece of work, I'm happy to elaborate more. I think there's a strong case that we heard in one of the later panels that there is a business case as well for pursuing inclusive growth, and companies can combine profit and purpose. And we've seen time and time again, by pursuing some of these strategies as part of your core business model, not talking about CSR or philanthropy, that you actually have big returns to profits. I think in some sectors you see even growth by over 10%. So I think that's something that we're trying to continue to push and to build more coalitions of the willing, and we hope that building on the platform and the metrics and all of these different pieces of evidence, that we'll have a toolkit for all stakeholders to come together to really help accelerate progress in this regard. And I see Scotland very much as an incubator for some of these ideas. I think they have a lot to offer and show the world, and the world has a lot to teach Scotland as well. And I hope that the forum can serve, and this platform can serve as a space for collaboration to continue the conversation where we left off, and make inclusive growth more than just an aspiration, but indeed a reality.
Okay, thank you very much, Gemma. That was really insightful again. So we've heard from Alenka about the kind of Slovenian experience, and then we've heard from another perspective from the WEF, which again parallels some of the earlier discussions. So it's really, really powerful. I'm going to come now to Gerry, who spoke in the very first session, to just get his general reflections on the day and anything else you want to add.
Well, thanks again, Gerry, for the invitation to be here, and to Anton also. It's been a privilege, as far as I'm concerned, to be in this room with the participants in this conference. And that's maybe that's my main takeaway. Just the level of intellectual firepower and the level of engagement, not to say Scottish passion, has really impressed me. And I say it's been a privilege for me to be here, and I've learned a lot. Maybe just three quick points that I think I heard. One, there was quite a bit of discussion around the paradigm shifting in terms of inclusive growth. I actually think the paradigm has shifted. I think the old model was that we'll do growth and we'll get good growth, and then we'll get to the inequality. You know, then we'll get to the inclusion bit. I think that has now changed. I mentioned this morning we had 189 finance ministers and, believe it or not, central bank governors at our annual meeting last week, and they were all talking about inclusion, you know, inclusive growth. So, you know, it gives me some hope that the paradigm has actually shifted. And that may sound like, you know, well, obviously, but I don't think it is obvious. I think it's a big finding that we don't need to trade off inequality with growth. I think that's important. So that's the first one, that paradigm shifted. The second thing I think I pick up is we don't have all the answers, but we've got some answers. And maybe we have enough answers to you know, put this thing in play a bit more effectively. I would argue that the macroeconomics matter. You know, I think monetary policy matters, fiscal policy matters. We talked about tax a lot in this conference. These are important levers. They make a big difference on inequality globally and in the country. So the macroeconomics matter a lot, but so do the microeconomics. And I think we need, what I heard is we need more effective approaches to lift incomes, and yes, lift jobs. The ILO is still telling us 200 million people without a job, people who want a job, don't have a job, 200 million. 70 million of those are young people. So we need more to lift incomes and lift jobs. The productivity is a big part of that, as Anton pointed out this morning. We need more effective investment in people, and we talked about that too. Education, health, and lifelong learning, I think, is going to be the name of the game. I was very pleased, and I know my boss back in Washington, Christine Lagarde, would have been very pleased to hear just how often the issue of women's empowerment and women's role in the economy came up in this conference. It seemed to me a pretty consistent theme. And, you know, she describes it as an economic no-brainer, a potential global game changer, just in a very practical sense, as we all agree. Half the population are suffering some form of discrimination, not contributing as much as they could if they were enabled to do so. So it was really encouraging to hear that at the conference. Finally, I'd characterize it as the opportunity referring back to the IMF's annual meeting last week, we forecast that global growth is, so global growth was 3.2% 2016. We forecast 3.6 for this year and 3.7 for next year. So these are relatively, certainly relative to what we've had in the recent past, these are healthy growth numbers for many parts of the world. That's not to say we're out of the woods, you know, obviously far from it. I just cited some of the unemployment numbers, for example. But maybe, and here's the opportunity, maybe it provides a bit of a breathing space, at least for many countries, to implement the reforms that can drive inclusive growth. We've had this horrible global financial crisis, and we've had the after effects of that for 10 years. So it looks like, at least on the growth front, that we may be finally recovering from that. So let's use this opportunity to implement the reforms that can drive us towards more inclusive growth. So, you know, I agree with what the First Minister said. It's not only the right thing to do, now is the right time to do it. And I'm very pleased and proud, actually, that Scotland is leading in this effort.
Thank you very much, Gerry. Again, a really useful recap, and thanks very much for sharing your thoughts. So we're getting to the very final stage of this conference today, and just before we invite Anton to come back on the stage, I'd like to thank the three speakers again for staying with us all day. Alenka was here at 7:45 this morning for an 8 o'clock meeting, and there's been a lot of meetings and networking at the margins of the conference, which has been really powerful, and it's really good for carrying on. Can I also thank the people over to the left here with the sashes on. They're all part of my staff back in the Scottish Government, and they've been doing various jobs today to get people in and out of rooms and here on time. So a big thank you to them and the speakers. And finally, can I invite Anton to come up and give us some closing reflections and close the conference?
Well, thank you very much, Gerry. And first of all, let me start by thanking everyone here for attending today's conference. It's been an absolute pleasure to welcome you here to the University of Glasgow. It's been an absolutely fascinating day for myself. I wanted to particularly thank, on behalf of Scottish Government, all the international delegates who've made a long journey to get here, from New Zealand, from Slovenia, from the US, from Costa Rica, from South Africa, France, Austria, Sweden. It's been a really international gathering, and I think it's wonderful that you've joined us today. It's absolutely impossible, Gerry, to give you a summary of what happened in 2 or 3 minutes, so I'm not going to even try to do that. What I was going to try and do is just perhaps just give you 4 reflections on today, which I regard as particularly important. The first, and I think it's partly the symbolism of what we saw today, it's that political and policy leadership is really important. It's absolutely going to be essential for inclusive growth to get traction. We heard that from our speakers in the final panel, and it's really heartening to see the Scottish Government's perspective with really welcome contributions from the Finance Minister, indeed the First Minister herself, whose leadership and commitment to the principles of inclusive growth have been vital to taking us in Scotland to this point. But, you know, beyond Scotland, it's wonderful to see that the conference has attracted political leadership from Sweden, through Minister Per Bolund, through Minister Alenka Smerkolj from Slovenia, and indeed support from international organisations like the OECD through Gabriela Ramos and Gerry Rice from the IMF. I mean, it's really unique to get that sort of coalition of interests together, and I think it's wonderful to see that. It's going to be, I think, absolutely essential for those international perspectives to continue in similar conferences in the future, but also for collaboration. You know, can we engender collaboration between these various countries? I think that will be critical. The second thing that I take away from this, I think it's some of the practical insights that we got from a number of the workshops starting this morning, also from the plenary session with colleagues from the University of Strathclyde, Sarah, Patricia, Harry, I think that was really interesting, where it shows you the holistic approaches that are being taken in a number of sectors, but also everything that we got from the business community and indeed public policy practices. A huge variety of different insights into how these policies can actually be put together. The third point I was going to make is around evidence-based policy and scalability. Gemma, you actually took the scalability point from me. I think that's absolutely right, because I think it's absolutely essential if we really want inclusive growth to be operationalized at government policy level, for it to be based on evidence that it's actually working, and Gabriela gave us lots of ideas around that. But at every point, I think we have to ask whether particular policy interventions, these are going to be complex, as we heard, integrated supply-side interventions. Are they scalable? Are they going to be scalable? Because frankly, that's the trick. I mean, Gabriela was contrasting some of these things to the welfare state, New Deal type policies. Well, New Deal type policies were scalable by definition. They were big demand side policies. Can we do the same with these? Because that's going to be, I think, the critical point as to whether we can implement. And especially when you get the sort of rapid technological change that Gerry was talking about, it's so rapid that frankly, pilot type projects are not going to do it. It's about how can we come up with policy dimensions which we can actually roll out and actually make a difference to inequality in a significant way. So scalability, I'm delighted that Gemma Corrigan made that point about scalability. I think the fourth point I was going to make, and the final point, I think one of the most important contributions that a conference such as this can achieve is to put the issue into the public domain. The First Minister very kindly this morning mentioned Adam Smith, and I noticed actually how many of you had taken selfies and tweeted your photos with Adam, or at least the statue downstairs. The First Minister pointed out that he's often misquoted, he's often misunderstood. Actually, perhaps even more important than his book on the wealth of nations is his theory of moral sentiments, as most of you will know. That was a book that he wrote as a result of the lectures that he gave here when he taught here in moral philosophy. And actually, it's a really interesting one, because in this work, Adam Smith noted that as human beings, we have a natural tendency to care about the well-being of others. This is not an alien concept. This is not something that's new. He called it sympathy. We would probably today call it empathy rather than sympathy. But actually, it's what he pointed out is in order to have this empathy, in order to care about these things, we need to either see the problems firsthand, or we have to have what he called a vivid depiction of other people's misfortunes. And I think that vivid depiction, making the problem that society faces today more real, I think is key, absolutely essential if policymakers have to have the support, the public support to enact some of these inclusive growth policies. So it's the political economy of all of this, if you like. It's understanding that unless we can persuade the majority of voters to vote for this, it's not going to work. And part of that is a vivid depiction of what we're doing. So it's been, just to conclude, it's been my privilege, it's been this university's privilege to play host to this fantastic event today. I'm firmly of the view that not only my university, but all the institutions present here will have an absolutely vital role to play in this area in the coming months and years. I hope you've taken as much out of it as I have, and I look forward to working with everybody here in the future to see what we can do to play to this agenda and make sure that we can address some of these major social and economic problems which have blighted our communities for far too long. Can I also add Gary's thanks to... Can I thank Gerry and his whole team, because I think they've done a fantastic job in organising the conference. And I know I'm speaking on everybody's behalf. And as the First Minister said in a keynote address, this is a collective agenda. I look forward to working with many of you in future, and I'm sure people will swap their contact addresses, and there'll be plenty of collaboration that will come as a result of this conference. So thank you very much for coming.